Hello, I'm Christy Johns from Australian Online News. Australian researchers have discovered two new marsupial species. The greater gliders are seriously cute and often referred to as flying baby koalas or clumsy possums. To tell us more is wildlife ecologist Dr Kara Youngentob. Kara, tell us more about these animals.
Well, it's actually long been suspected that what was thought to be one species might be multiple species, but we didn't actually know this at the time when we started looking at what we were looking at. I have a PhD student that I'm co-supervising with Professor Andrew Krochenberger at JCU, and she wanted to look at how climate impacts the body size of one species that had a large distribution. And we thought the greater glider would be perfect for that because they were thought to have a very wide distribution all the way from the tropics in northern Queensland down south to the cooler forests in Victoria. And they have very big differences in body size. So she went and looked at the animals up north and down south, and she caught some of them for her study and took small tissue samples, didn't hurt the animals, and released them again. And she noticed when she was taking measurements and looking at her data that they're actually profoundly different. And she sent those samples away for DNA analysis, and it came back that they were incredibly different, so much so that they were likely to be different species. And so that made us all stop for a minute and think, oh goodness, we can't ask what we wanted to ask with this animal, but this is incredible in its own right. And about the same time, there was a new issue of the Gliding Mammals of the World that came out, in which the authors speculated that the greater glider was multiple species based on another group that were measuring museum specimens of these animals. But there was no published data to support or deny that proposition. And they suggested that there was actually a third species that was somewhere in central Queensland. So our student said, can I go there? Like, I want to go and see. And we were like, absolutely, go. Like, look at these animals and, tell us what you find. So she went and she captured some greater gliders there, took very small tissue samples, let them go again unharmed, sent that away for genetic analysis. And indeed, that was, again, a different animal. So for the first time, we were delighted to be able to provide both morphological and genetic support for the proposition that these are three species, not just one species.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's not every day that you find two new species, is it?
It's not. This is really probably a once in a career, once in a lifetime opportunity to be able to work with this team.
And we've got a picture of all three species. So what's the main differences between the three?
So body size, as well as some aspects of their physiology and metabolism, you can see in the picture, the one on the right, that's the one that most people are familiar with who are familiar with greater gliders. And I would say before now, that was probably only a handful of people anyway. And that's the southern species, P. volans. The one that's in the top left-hand corner, that's the most northern species. The big difference between the one in the south and the north is that the one in the north is about half the size of the one in the south. And then the third species, which is underneath on the left-hand side in the bottom left-hand corner, that's P. armillatus. And it's intermediate both in its location and in its body size. There's also differences in ear size and, as you can see, hair coloration. The one in the south comes in many different color morphs. So it has long, fluffy hair, a bit like a Persian cat, and it's all hair. So if you catch one and it happens to glide into a stream on the way and gets wet, you realize it just shrinks, to almost nothing because it's just a big fluff ball. But they're black or white or gray or a combination of all those colors. Whereas the northern two species, they tend to be more of a brown color. And the very highest distribution northern one, P minor, it has like almost a shimmery sheen to its hair that's caused by these little bands of light and dark coloration at the end of its fur.
Wow. So what do we know about their behaviour and what they eat and their habitat?
Well, they're all eucalypt-folivores, so they all have a specialist diet. They only eat eucalyptus leaves from a variety of different eucalypt trees. Fortunately, there's a lot of eucalypts in Australia, so there's a lot of food for them. They need hollows. They need big, large, hollow-bearing trees because they hide in those hollows during the daytime and they sleep there, and they have their babies there. And they just come out at night, so they're entirely nocturnal. We know that they only have one child at a time, a bit like us, and they have a very low energy diet, so that keeps them from being able to have large litters. And that low energy diet of eucalypt leaves is also probably responsible for their locomotion, which is gliding, because it doesn't take a lot of energy to glide from tree to tree. And unlike the sugar glider, which most people know much better, and they're really hyperactive little gremlins, these sugar gliders, the greater glider is just very calm and slow and will just sit there and look at you from the treetops. So it's a lovely animal to watch. And during the season when they come together and make another little greater glider, you often see them sitting up in the canopy with their long tails intertwined around each other, which is just precious.
Oh, that's adorable. Are they hard to spot?
Yes, they can be difficult to see. I think that's largely why one people didn't realize the type of diversity that existed within this animal. It was very cryptic because they live at the top of canopies in the forest and they're only out at night. So when you go to see them, you go out with a big spotlight and you shine it up in the tree canopy, and their eyes reflect the light and glow back at you. But even so, you just see them kind of silhouetted against the night sky and you don't get a very clear view of them. They can easily be mistaken for other possums unless you can clearly see their long tail, which distinguishes them clearly from the other possums that might be in the tree. And they used to be very common. So if you had gone out to a eucalypt forest anywhere across the range, you would be very likely to see them if you knew what you were looking for and had a powerful light. But unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. And we've seen some alarming declines in their populations across the range, but particularly the southern species is a bit of a worry now.
Yeah, I think I heard their numbers had dropped 80% in the past 20 years. What's causing them to decline in numbers?
That's right. David Lindenmayer has been doing some long-term studies, some of the longest-term studies of any animal, and including these greater gliders in Victoria and New South Wales. And over the past 30 years, they've gone from being very common to population declines in the order of magnitude of 80%. And in some places, they've even gone entirely extinct in local areas. So near Jervis Bay and in the lower elevation sites of the Blue Mountains, where they've been watching them, they found they've disappeared from when they started to present day. And that's all happened in the last 30 years. The reason for that is a combination of habitat loss from logging native forests, which gets rid of big hollow bearing trees, as well as the food that they need, as well as fire and elevated temperature. So when the fire goes through the forest, it's devastating for these little animals. It burns the food that they have to eat, and they don't have the energy reserves that we do. So they can't go more than a night or two without food. They can't wait for those leaves to grow back, and they don't move large distances. Again, they don't have lots of energy. So they need their food where they live. So both fire and logging, as well as human development, is causing loss of habitat. And then climate change, warm nights. Not a lot of people know this, but night times are heating up faster than the daytime. And what's hot for these guys is very different than what's hot for us. So because they're nocturnal, they're used to being active in a much cooler nighttime climate. And temperatures for the southern species over 20 degrees means that it actually has to start actively cooling itself. That starts to get hot for this animal. And when it gets hotter than that, the mid 20s to the high 20s, it puts it off its food. A bit like us when we're really hot, we don't feel like eating much. And that's really deadly for this animal that gets both its water and its energy from eucalypt. So if it doesn't eat, it dies. And hot nights are making it lose its appetite. So that's a big worry.
So where does your study go from here? Is that the end of it, or now you're going to look into each separate species and find out how many are actually out there?
I think there's a lot more to do in this space. So identifying these as three different species really highlights the lack of information that we have about the central and the northern species. Almost nothing is known about those animals, and shows us that we urgently need to take action to help protect the southern species that is the most researched animal. We're starting to look at some of the differences in energetics and metabolism across the different species. And our PhD student, Denise McGregor, she's doing some of the first studies on home range to identify how much space and area and how these animals use the landscape for the northern species and comparing that to the southern species. We're also doing some post-fire recovery work in Victoria in partnership with the Victorian government, where we're looking at whether nest boxes can help these animals recover more quickly after fire to give them a home so they can move in somewhere when the leaves have recovered enough to eat, but they may not have hollows to sleep in yet. And we're also looking at ways that we can help reduce some of the changes that happen to forests in response to disturbance. So when you have fire or logging, disturbance adapted tree species grow first. And not all of those tree species are good food. In fact, some of them are very bad food. and they have an advantage over the other tree species. So we need to help those better food species get established after disturbance to make sure that that home recovers, that the greater gliders can move back into. I think one of the best parts of being able to work on this is seeing other people discover these animals, because they are just incredible animals. And I think it's amazed me that not more people know about them. And so seeing things like Twitter just light up with different people tweeting about this makes me very happy that the world is getting to know these really amazing creatures too.